It's an honor for me to be speaking to you today and present to you an overarching findings of the public Unodc publication on aggravating smuggling of migrants and gender. Before we get into the gender dimensions, I wanted to quickly remind everybody on the legal framework that is applicable. The UN Smuggling of Migrant Protocol contains 3 basic offenses, among which also the smuggling of migrant offense as defined as an act of procuring the illegal entry of a person into a state of which he or she is not a national or permanent resident from. Next to the smuggling of migrant offenses in a strict sense, it also contains the offense of creating, possessing, providing travel or ID documents and the enabling of irregular stay, as long as it is committed for the purpose of obtaining a material or financial benefit. These basic offenses are contained in Article 6.1 of the UN SOM protocol. Next to these basic offenses, we also have 2 sets of mandatory aggravations that oblige states that are required to foresee in their national legislation that these 2 sets of aggravations are considered as an aggravation to the main offense. These are namely, oh, can you still see it? Here you go. These are namely the endangering of a migrant's life or safety, or the inhuman or degrading treatment, including exploitation of the migrant concerned. These mandatory aggravations contained in Article 6.3 are the basis, are the scope of the study that we are launching in the upcoming summer as well. The aim of these aggravations is to recognize the seriousness of these acts and to allow for more severe sentences to be handed down to smugglers. Just wanted to quickly mention as well that states are at liberty to decide other sets of aggravation to their basic smuggling of migrant offenses. These and here I refer to the UNODC model law against smuggling of migrants that have summarized them in a comprehensive way. So let's talk about the gender dimensions. In a spirit to keep this presentation short and concise, I will select 3 abuses, aggravations that are considered in the study that is about to be published. First of all, the physical violence and inhuman and degrading treatment. It is by far the most commonly reported crime by men. It is often exercised with no obvious purpose other than to punish the victims, intimidate or coerce the victims. Most severe forms of violence, like torture or inhuman and degrading treatment, are often exercised in the form of extorting the victim or extorting family members to pay ransom. It is a highly gendered phenomenon. Several court cases could be identified where perpetrators specifically separated men and females in, for example, a detention facility to exercise different forms of violence upon them, with men experiencing severe forms of physical torture and females experiencing sexual torture. Regarding sexual violence and witnessing of sexual violence, it seems to be omnipresent in migration routes and affects at a much higher proportion female victims. Sexual violence is perpetrated as a form of retaliation for alleged misconduct, for the purpose of intimidating or coercing the victim, or as a means of payment, what we formulated as transactional rape, for which females are coerced into sexual services as a means for payment, for example, for the next leg of the journey. It could also be perpetrated with no specific purpose other than demonstration of power, misogyny, or in the form of sexual gratification. It is important to mention that the gender impact of sexual violence, specifically on women, most notably the medical implications for women and girls that may have unwanted pregnancies or are forced into abortion practices, sometimes in areas that do not allow for abortion. Sexual violence experienced by men often target them as there's within their social norm considered in a male-dominated society. Sexual violence experienced by men often target them to humiliate the victim, for example, in order to witness sexual violence exercised against family members or other members of their community, in the form of genital violence, including beating and burning and amputating, or in the form of rape and sexual exploitation. Thirdly, the death along Mediterranean sea routes. Here, I have to mention the limitation that we faced in the study, and looked specifically at death occurring as part of the Mediterranean sea crossing, which, according to the recent global report on smuggling of migrants, represents about 46% of worldwide detected migrant facilities. Regarding the gender dimensions, a majority of people traveling are adult men. However, women seem to be running a disproportionately higher risk of dying while during the sea crossing. Women's position on the boat is often determined by misconceptions that unintentionally endanger them more. Women are often put into the responsibility for caring for young children or sick migrants while traveling, and often are faced with reduced mobility and an increased risk of dehydration due to pregnancies, some of which are the consequences of sexual violence experienced in a previous leg. I believe Georgia will be talking more about these aspects. The study also addresses the state responses to these aggravations. Relatively early on in the study, general challenges of prosecuting aggravated migrant smuggling offences could be identified. For example, prosecuting abuses experienced by migrants as standalone offences, for example, as rape charges or as charges of sexual assault, versus as an aggravated form of migrant smuggling. Secondly, it became apparent that many instances of aggravated smuggling were not prosecuted in the countries where they occurred, but in other countries. The study offers some initial discussions of these challenges and proposes some elements to be taken into consideration. For example, the available coordination mechanism, the applicable law, the jurisdictional issues, but also the interest, the protection and assistance interest of the smuggled migrants at hand. Secondly, the study offers an analysis of the legal and practical barriers that prevent migrants from reporting abuses and applies a gender lens to them. For example, there may be legislative obstacles, for example, not containing in the national legislation the mandatory aggravations or aggravations that are linked to the experiences of abuses encountered by migrants. But others as well, for example, legislation criminalizing the abuses, for example, criminalizing LGBTQI conduct or the impact of sexual violence, for example, considering them as a form of adultery or impact of, for example, not foreseeing the availability of legal abortions in some areas. Next, also, other practical barriers exist, for example, violence exercised against migrants. There are several reports that report about extreme forms of violence and neglect, also exercised by the hands of public officials. Last but not least, the nature of the crime needs to be mentioned, as well as the MO. One expert interviewed for the study believed that the lack of data could be to the lack of legal institution where migrants can safely report these crimes while on the journey, but also due to the overall reluctance to report these abuses, given the wide sense of impunity and lack of trust in authorities. In addition, the routes taken and methods taken by smugglers to smuggle migrants also prevent them from entering into contact with places where they could report these abuses that they have experienced. Generally, there seems to be a lack of gender responses in the responses of states. Despite the fact that gender seems to play an important role in how these offenses are committed and what specific assistance and protection needs smuggled migrants have. The study tries to address the severe lack, or try to highlight the severe lack of available data in this perspective, but also wants to address some limitations regarding access to justice and challenges faced by investigators and prosecutors. It wants to be a first step to serve as a stepping stone for further discussion, and wants to see that state responses consider these gender dimensions in order to better understand how smuggling of migrants is perpetrated, and to better understand and to offer gender-sensitive protection and assistance measure, and to prevent impunity for a heinous crime. I thank you for your attention, and I give it back to Morgan.